Number 1. The Walker. I was making a cross-country drive back in the 1970s. My family lived in the Midwest, but I had joined the military right out of high school. I was stationed in San Diego, and I was there all by myself. I couldn't afford to fly back at the time, and it was unlikely that my family would have come out to see me, so I had to drive across the country when I was on leave in order to have any time to spend with them. This was my first time driving such a long distance before, and I wasn't quite prepared for how overwhelming an experience it could be. I couldn't afford to stay in motels every night either, so I would find a place alongside the road whenever I got tired, and then I would just sleep in my car. While I was driving through some of the centermost states in the country, I saw some really interesting things, such as scary lightning bolts that looked like they were coming out of the ground and leaping into the sky. I really wasn't too scared of that, but it was like seeing something I had never seen before. Now, it was when I was going through the desert states that I had a truly frightening experience that I can't explain. I had never picked up a hitchhiker before, but there were a lot more of them around, it seemed, compared to nowadays. I had never even considered picking up one before, and the first few times that I came across one on my journey, I kept up with this. However, after passing by several hitchhikers in the first day of my trip, I began to start feeling sorry for these people. I didn't have it great, but I figured that I at least had a car and could help someone by giving them a ride. This was sort of weird, I thought, for being in a desert, but the sky became overcast. I didn't think that it was going to rain. It just didn't feel like rain, but there was still some distant thunder in the sky. I figured it was just dry lightning. Still, I just kept driving. It seemed like I got closer and closer under the clouds. I stopped at a gas station, and I didn't truly notice the weather until I had gotten out of the car. The wind was blowing really hard, and it pulled the car door open as soon as I had unlatched it. I had quite a time getting everything done, and then getting back into the car. There were some restaurants and some motels at the exit, and if I had the money for it, I probably would have pulled over and gotten myself a room. It was nighttime, so at the very least I could have pulled into the parking lot of one of the motels to try and get some rest. But I really wasn't tired or ready for that, so I kept on the road. It was the strangest storm because it went on for the longest time, even as I was driving against it. There was no rain, just really strong wind and lots of thunder and lightning. I'm not sure how long I had been driving when I caught sight of something up ahead of me. It was someone who was walking along the side of the road, or so it looked to me. I was able to tell because of the flashes of light that helped illuminate the area, and I was wondering why someone would be walking out there. And that was when I decided that I should probably pull over and offer this person a ride. I began to slow down as I got closer to the walker. I wouldn't call them a hitchhiker because they made no effort to try and get a ride. But I still thought I would offer one because I couldn't imagine that anyone would want to be out in this weather. I pulled to the side of the road when I got closer to the walker. I stopped several yards behind him and I flashed my lights, as if to tell him that I was willing to give him a ride. I didn't want to pull too close and frighten him. The walker didn't pay any attention to me and kept on walking. I then opened up the car door and stood out, yelling at the guy, asking him if he wanted a ride. At first he did nothing, but he did eventually stop walking. Then, he slowly turned around to look at me. He may have been about 15 feet away in front of the car, but he didn't walk back to me. He just stood there, looking at me. Just then, The whole area was lit up by a brilliant flash of lightning. I only got that brief second of a flash of light, but noticed several things when I did. First, the guy looked positively disturbed, like he had just escaped from a hospital for the criminally insane. Second, he had a really large knife in his hand. He must have been carrying it while he walked, but just seemed weird by itself. After the flash was over, my eyes took a few moments before they became adjusted to the dark again. It wasn't easy with the light from my headlights shining up in front of the car too. But when I was able to see again, I noticed that the man was slowly walking toward me in the car. Trying to be a good person was suddenly the very last thing I cared about. This whole situation was just too terrifying to me. I jumped back into my car and then got back to driving. As I drove by the man, he stopped and looked at my car while it passed him by. I didn't get a good look at him then either, not caring to see him. It took only a few moments before I had pulled well past the man and was on my way again. I was mildly shaken up by what I had seen, whether I was truly in danger or not. I kept driving that night. I wanted to get far, far ahead of where I was before I decided to go to sleep in my car. The last thing I wanted to do was wake up having that guy with the knife looking into my car window. Number 2. Breakdown. Growing up, my parents always told me that I should mind my own business. And I don't mean like with other adults that you're friends with or family members. What they meant was that when you live in a certain area, especially in the more rural areas, you should always just leave everyone alone, because you never know what they might be up to. I preface with that because of something that I came across when I was a teenager. I had worked with my dad to fix up an old car when I became old enough to drive. It was the very definition of an old beater car, but it was cool to have a car nonetheless. I got a part-time job, doing some work as a mechanic to make money so I could get gas and hang out with my friends whenever I wanted to. We liked driving around town, but we really preferred driving around in the countryside. We always felt like we could do whatever we wanted to when we were out there. We could drive as fast as we wanted to, have a beer if we wanted to, without getting into trouble. This doesn't defend me doing it then, but we only did it while driving on the back roads, where we were less likely to run into anyone else. I remember this summer day when my friend Joe and I were driving around and having a few beers. This was back in the early 1980s. It was a very bright day. I recall that, and we were driving in an area that I wasn't familiar with. So you can imagine my dismay when the car eventually stalled. No matter what I tried, I couldn't get it to start working again. So Joe and I had to walk to hopefully find a house with a phone so we could call and get my dad to come out and help us. We were walking through the hills, hoping to find a driveway, knowing that it could take a while. There were not a whole lot of houses out there, and we couldn't recall when we had seen the previous one. It didn't help that we were quite tipsy while we searched for the help that we needed. We eventually came to a driveway. It was a really long driveway that swerved down and around the hill, so we couldn't see the house at the end of it. But we knew it was a driveway because there was a mailbox there and several signs telling us not to trespass. Joe didn't want to go find the house because of the signs, but I didn't think that it would be a big deal. Most of the houses around in the country had those signs, so I went and he reluctantly followed behind me. The driveway was sort of like a road all on its own. It led pretty far back, and it took a while before we even could see the house. When we did, it wasn't very comforting. The house looked positively old, decrepit, and possibly abandoned. Joe even doubted that they could have a phone that far out. However, I convinced him that if they didn't, I could probably persuade the owner to drive us into town so that we could find a phone to call my dad. The yard the house was in was a stark contrast to what we had seen the rest of the day. Most of the sunlight was blocked by the very tall trees that hung over the house. Joe was nervous as hell the whole time as we walked up. He thought the house might be abandoned, but there was a pickup truck parked next to it, so I thought it was likely that there was someone there. As we came closer to the house, I saw the curtains move in the second-floor window. Someone stood there for a short moment before closing the curtains. I mentioned this to Joe, confirming that someone was there. However, I don't think this comforted him at all. We got closer and closer up to the house, but we were still not that close up to it when we saw someone come out onto the front porch. It looked like it was a regular-sized guy, if we could guess what regular size would be, and he was carrying something in his hand. I called out, telling him that I was sorry that we were on his property, but we were wondering if he could help us out because our car had stalled. Rather than answer us, the guy walked onto the steps of his front porch. It was only then that I was able to see what he was carrying. He lifted the chainsaw up and pulled on the ripcord, starting the chainsaw. He then slowly began walking toward us. Joe didn't hesitate and he turned and ran off. I was either in shock or I didn't think the guy was serious. I can't say which, but he was walking toward me with a chainsaw in his hand. And at one point, before he got to me, I just lost all of my nerve. He began moving faster, and I realized this guy was serious. I could see the look in his eyes. I ran and chased after Joe. I looked over my shoulder, and the guy was still coming toward us. So I didn't look back again, and I continued running. At that point, I had no doubt in my mind that the man was serious about hurting us. But fortunately, unlike in horror movies, running with a chainsaw is not an easy thing to do. So Joe and I were able to get away and down the road without the man making a significant gain on us. We had to then walk back to the car and then try whatever we could to just fix the car. Eventually someone drove by and told us he would drive us into town so we could call someone. While we were riding, we told him about the house and about the crazy guy with the chainsaw. I told him I didn't think the guy would have hurt us, but it was pretty scary. He told us that we were extremely lucky that we had ran. The guy who lived in that house wouldn't have helped us. He had also shot several people who had trespassed on his property before. There was no doubt in that man's mind that if that man caught up with us, he would have used that chainsaw on us. Number 3. Cousin's Place. I have quite a few relatives who live way out in the country. It's not like I live in the city or anything myself. I live in a trailer on the side of the road before you get out to the more country areas around me. But even with this sort of setting, I still spend a lot of time driving deeper into the country whenever I want to visit a family member. It was on this night that I decided I was going to drive out and see a cousin of mine who lived way out in the middle of nowhere. In order to get to his place, I had to drive along the main road that led further out into the hills before eventually leaving on Rural Route 5, which then took me into the much more rural areas and then deep into the hills where my cousin lived. He was also having a few of his friends over that I always enjoyed partying with. Being a fan of scary situations, I always enjoyed driving out in this area. It was far enough out that the only light, other than the light from your headlights, was the moon. Nothing really scary had ever happened to me before driving out there, and I hadn't been scared of the dark since I was a kid, so I didn't expect anything to happen when I was going out there. Now, even though there was a road that led to my cousin's house, there were only a very few houses along that road the further you went along. It was also pretty warm outside on this evening, so I was driving with the window rolled down and my elbow hanging out the window. The road itself was pretty narrow, so the branches from the trees would occasionally be hitting the side of my car. I was also driving relatively slowly along the road because it was pretty twisty and turny, and you couldn't see very far up ahead, as I had mentioned. But I did have my high beams on, and when I did, after driving for a while, I noticed that there was someone walking alongside the road. They were not very far up ahead of me. They were walking along the right side of the road. I had never seen anyone walking out there at that time of night before, and I wondered if I should stop and offer them a ride. Even before I slowed down, the man walking stopped walking and turned to face me. I pulled up slowly next to him and rolled down the window on the passenger side, and I will always remember exactly how he laid up against the car. He bent over, his arms crossed, and laid them on my window, with his head partially inside the car. I asked him what was up, and what he was doing out this late. I talked about the lack of residences out there, and wondered if he knew my cousin. My cousin's name was Todd, and I did give him the name. He claimed that he did know Todd, and that he was actually going to see him right now. It was when he said that I first began feeling a bit uncomfortable. It was almost like he was just agreeing with me to be doing so. I wasn't sure. I began to wish that I had just driven on, but that possibility was long gone. I didn't even have to offer the guy a ride. He brought it up, suggesting that I take him to Todd's house with me, adding that it would just be nice of you to do that. It would save me a bit of a walk. I think it was because I was getting nervous and didn't want to look at the guy right in the eyes that I turned my head and I looked at my driver's side mirror. When I did, I was able to see that there was a third person who was creeping along the side of my car, approaching my door. The man on the passenger side must have seen this, and he tried to open up the passenger side door. Like I mentioned, I had not unlocked it, so he wasn't able to get it open. However, he immediately reached into the car, looking around for the lock. The guy creeping on my side of the car must have known what was happening, because he got up and quickly came toward my window. I hit the gas, just as the guy tried to grab at me through my open window. The guy's hand touched my arm right before I was able to drive away. I looked over at the passenger side door, and the guy was flailing his arm, trying to find the lock to the door. However, I pulled away fast enough that it knocked him away from the window. I was able to get away slowly, but still quickly enough to leave the two guys behind. I got to my cousin's house without further incident. Once inside, I told him about what had happened, and he asked me to describe the guy I saw. I did, and he knew who the guy was. And not only did he know who the guy was, he knew the guy did not like him. We ended up taking his party out to the front porch, and he took his shotgun with him. He figured that those two guys were coming to pay him an unpleasant visit, so he wanted to make sure that he was out there and ready for them. No one ever ended up showing up that night, though. Todd thought that maybe Since they encountered me, they figured that I let him know that they were coming, so there wasn't any encounter that night. As for why the guys were walking, well, they didn't have a car. That is why they tried to take mine from me. Todd was pretty sure that the guys were looking to kill him, and he told me I was lucky that I drove off when I did. Hey all, Killer Orange Cat here. First I want to thank all of my paid Patreon subscribers, starting with my 2 VIPs, Chiamerah Cat and Pixie Hopper 8. I also want to thank Heidi H, Chronic J, Stinky News, EricaOdd, Tracy Sellars, Kelli Clark, and Broken Angel. First I want to apologize if my voice seems a little off today, or if I seem like I'm hurrying through the words. I'm not hurrying, it's like I'm probably got a little bit of a cold. My uvula is a little swollen, and if you've ever had a swollen uvula, you know that's really a pain in the butt. But I really wanted to get this out now, so I hope everything sounds fine, and I hope you like the stories. I hope that everybody is having a good new year. Plus I'll be having a new Patreon story up within the next day or two. It's already written. It's about something that actually happened to me and my sister about maybe 6 weeks ago, and I haven't really told the full story yet, so I wanted to go ahead and include that. In the meantime, if you like this video, please let me know by hitting the like button. If you're not already subscribed to Killer Orange Cat, and you want to be, please hit the subscribe button and the bell to be notified of new material. Leave me a comment, which I'll try to my best to get back to, and share the video with someone you think might enjoy it. If you have an original story you'd like narrated on Killer Orange Cat, please send it to the address included in the description. And now I'd like to mention all of my free Patreon members: Anthony Bowers, Remi, Venikins, Rose Metro, Woofer McWooferson, Cindy Cleveland, Vanapira Rayne, William H, Alien Unicorn 13, Kathryn Lynch, The Bama Guy 334, Michael Vasquez, Bonnie Lynn, Collet Bond, Krista Pike, Prince UVA, HF Creations, Bonnie Gibbs, Linda Moore, DJ Lira, Evil Black Cat, Lori Hicks, Lisa Herman, and Krystal Robin. In the meantime, don't forget to make sure to check in your closet and check under your bed, because you never know where a Killer Orange Cat might be hiding. Good night.